Welcome into a workshop of ambition, desperation, and dangerous imagination. During World War II, Nazi Germany poured enormous resources into so-called Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons, meant to reverse a losing war. Between 1943 and 1945, engineers raced against time to build jet fighters, long-range rockets, super tanks, and even early concepts of space travel. Some inventions, like the V-2 rocket designed under Wernher von Braun, were technologically revolutionary but strategically flawed, rushed, or impossibly expensive. Others never made it past blueprints, collapsing under shortages, internal rivalry, or sheer fantasy. While these projects failed to save the Third Reich, they left unsettling questions behind. What if they had worked, and at what cost? Innovation driven by ideology can reshape the world or destroy it. Today, we explore the failed inventions of the Nazis and how history might have looked very different had these machines moved from prototype to power. In the winter of 1943, as snow fell on the bombed-out factories of the Ruhr Valley and German armies retreated across the frozen steppes of Russia, Albert Speer stood before Adolf Hitler with a sobering economic assessment. Germany's Minister of Armaments had calculated that the Reich was losing the war of production by a catastrophic margin. The United States alone was outproducing Germany in aircraft by a ratio of 5-1, and that gap was widening every month. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals and running 24 hours a day, were churning out tanks faster than German forces could destroy them. Britain, though battered and exhausted, continued to rebuild its bomber fleets with stubborn determination. The numbers told a story that Nazi propaganda could not hide. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of Allied industrial might. Speer had compiled these statistics with his characteristic precision, documenting that in 1943 alone, the United States would produce 85,000 aircraft, while Germany would struggle to manufacture 25,000. The gap in tank production was equally damning. The Soviets were producing T-34 seconds at a rate of 1,300 per month from their Tankograd facilities in Chelyabinsk, while German Panzer production barely reached 600 monthly across all models. Hitler's response was not despair but defiance. "We will compensate through quality what we lack in quantity," he declared, a statement that would unleash one of history's most bizarre and ambitious campaigns of technological innovation, a desperate race to invent weapons so revolutionary they could single-handedly reverse the tide of war. Speer later recalled in his memoir, Inside the Third Reich, that Hitler's eyes had taken on that peculiar glassy quality that indicated he had retreated into his world of fantasy, where mathematics could be overcome by willpower. This wasn't mere bravado. The Nazi regime had already demonstrated that technological breakthroughs could deliver strategic advantages that defied conventional military wisdom. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940 had succeeded not through numerical superiority, but through innovative combined arms tactics, radio-coordinated armor movements, and Stuka dive bombers that functioned as aerial artillery. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions had torn through Poland in just 27 days, using wireless communication to coordinate movements with a speed that left traditional military planners stunned. When France fell in just 6 weeks during the summer of 1940, military analysts worldwide were forced to acknowledge that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, then a junior French tank commander who would later lead Free France, bitterly noted that the German army had reinvented war while we were still preparing to refight 1918. The Wehrmacht's use of the Enigma encryption machine to coordinate operations gave them a crucial communications advantage, at least until British codebreakers at Bletchley Park began cracking the system in 1941. The lesson Hitler drew from these victories was both logical and catastrophically flawed. If innovation had won him Western Europe, then even more radical innovation could win him the world. What he failed to understand was that those early victories had relied on existing technology deployed in novel ways, not on experimental wonder weapons that existed only in blueprints and fevered imaginations. The tanks that conquered France were reliable Panzer Es and IVs, not exotic superweapons. The Stukas were conventional aircraft used unconventionally, not jets or rockets. By 1942, the German scientific and industrial establishment had been reorganized into a sprawling network of research institutions, each racing to develop the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons that would deliver Hitler his impossible victory. The Luftwaffe operated its own extensive research centers, the most famous being the facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where Wernher von Braun's team developed rocket technology. Established in April 1937 on a remote island, Peenemünde grew into a massive complex employing over 12,000 people at its peak, complete with wind tunnels, production facilities, and a liquid oxygen plant. The site was chosen specifically for its isolation rockets, had a tendency to explode during testing, and the empty Baltic coast provided space for failure. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's corpulent and increasingly erratic commander, presided over a research empire that consumed resources at an astonishing rate. He established the Luftwaffe Research Center at Vulkenroad near Brunswick, which at its peak employed over 1,500 scientists and engineers working on everything from jet engines to guided missiles. Göring also controlled the Hermann Göring Works, a massive industrial conglomerate that operated mines, steelworks, and weapons factories across occupied Europe, often using slave labor. His personal art collection, looted from across Europe, was stored in the same bunker complex where sensitive weapons research was conducted, a telling symbol of the regime's moral bankruptcy. Göring's personal motto for these programs was characteristically grandiose: "I decide what is a miracle weapon." The irony, lost on Göring, was that miracles cannot be ordered into existence like munitions from a factory. His morphine addiction, which worsened throughout the war, made him increasingly unreliable as a scientific administrator, often approving contradictory projects or cancelling promising programs on a whim. Meanwhile, the SS had carved out its own domain of secret weapons development, operating under Heinrich Himmler's direct authority and shrouded in layers of classification that sometimes prevented even other Nazi agencies from knowing what they were doing. Himmler, who fancied himself a mystic and racial scientist, created research programs that blended legitimate engineering with ideological pseudoscience in ways that would have been comedic if they weren't so sinister. The SS established facilities like the Institute for Military Scientific Research, which conducted horrific medical experiments masquerading as science, and various occult research programs that sought technological breakthroughs through mysticism. At Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia, Himmler assembled what he called the SS Order Castle, complete with a specially designed circular room called the Obergruppenführersaal, where he held séances and discussed ancient Germanic legends that he believed held secrets to advanced technology. The castle featured a crypt with 12 stone pedestals arranged in a circle, intended to hold the coats of arms of Himmler's 12 most senior SS leaders, a grotesque parody of King Arthur's Round Table. Officers who visited later described the surreal experience of discussing rocketry and tank design in rooms decorated with runic symbols and pseudo-medieval regalia. Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff, recalled in post-war testimony that Himmler genuinely believed that scientific breakthroughs could be achieved through meditation and racial purity, and that he once delayed an important weapons briefing because his astrologer had warned against making decisions on that particular day. The SS also operated a network of concentration camp factories where slave laborers produced weapons under nightmarish conditions. Mittelbau-Dora, where V-2 rockets were assembled, became one of the most infamous, with a death rate so high that an estimated 20,000 prisoners died building the rockets, far more than the weapons would kill when used against Allied cities. The major German industrial firms, Messerschmitt, Henschel, Heinkel, Junkers, and others found themselves caught in a strange dance with the regime, simultaneously benefiting from massive military contracts while struggling under increasingly impossible demands. Willy Messerschmitt, the brilliant but difficult aircraft designer, had already created the Bf-109, which became the Luftwaffe's primary fighter and one of the war's most successful aircraft designs, with over 33,000 produced, is less than #0. 4 is greater than, but by 1943, Messerschmitt was under pressure to deliver something revolutionary. His company's design bureau in Augsburg became a hotbed of experimental projects, some brilliant and some bordering on the absurd. Messerschmitt himself was a prickly perfectionist who clashed constantly with Luftwaffe officials. He had been briefly imprisoned in 1940 after a dispute with Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's director of air armament, over production delays. His personal relationship with Hitler provided protection, but also created pressure to deliver miracle weapons. Engineers worked on the Me-262 jet fighter, which represented a genuine leap forward, while simultaneously being forced to divert resources to projects like the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that was so dangerous to its own pilots that it killed more German aviators in accidents than Allied aircraft in combat. The Comet could reach speeds of 596 miles per hour, faster than anything else in the sky, but its volatile fuel mixture, a combination of concentrated hydrogen peroxide and hydrazine hydrate, methanol, had a tendency to explode on landing, sometimes dissolving pilots alive in a chemical reaction so horrific that ground crews developed psychological trauma from recovering bodies. Test pilot Heini Dittmar, who flew the Comet to record speeds, described the experience as riding a bomb with wings. The landing procedure was particularly treacherous. The aircraft had to glide unpowered after exhausting its fuel, and any remaining propellant in the tanks could explode on impact. One pilot, Yossi Perz, survived a crash landing only to be splashed with residual T-stuff, which ate through his flight suit and severely burned his body before ground crew could wash him down. He spent months in hospital and never flew again. Henschel, another major contractor, developed the world's first operational guided anti-ship missile, the HS-293, which German bombers used with devastating effect against Allied shipping in 1943. The weapon was controlled by radio, with the bombardier steering it toward the target using a joystick while watching a flare in the missile's tail. On the 11th of September 1943, an HS-293 sank the Italian battleship Roma as it attempted to sail to Malta to surrender to the Allies, killing 1,393 sailors, including Admiral Carlo Bergamini. The explosion was so massive that the ship broke in half and sank in just 20 minutes. Days later, another HS-293 severely damaged the British cruiser HMS Ugandan off Salerno. The weapon proved that radio-guided missiles were no longer science fiction but battlefield reality. Yet Henschel's engineers were also forced to work on projects that defied both physics and common sense, including designs for enormous flying platforms and stratospheric bombers that existed only to satisfy Hitler's demand for spectacular revenge strikes against American cities. The Henschel HS-132 dive bomber was designed to be powered by a jet engine mounted on top of the fuselage, with the pilot lying prone in a pressurized cockpit to better withstand G-forces, a configuration so uncomfortable and impractical that test pilots refused to endorse it, though prototypes were built anyway. Kurt Tank, the celebrated designer at Focke-Wulf, later remarked that by 1944, half of German aviation research was devoted to projects that could never work, ordered by people who understood nothing of aerodynamics. The paradox of Nazi weapons development was that it housed genuine scientific talent alongside crackpots and ideologues, and the regime increasingly struggled to distinguish between them. The Nazis' racial ideology had already crippled German physics by driving away Jewish scientists like Albert Einstein, Lise Meitner, and Edward Teller exiles, who would later contribute to the Allied atomic bomb program. Einstein, who had fled Germany in 1933, never forgave his former colleagues who remained and collaborated with the regime. When physicist Max Planck visited him to ask if he might return to Germany after the war, Einstein reportedly said, "I would rather be cut to pieces than ever set foot in Germany again." What remained was a scientific establishment that had to navigate the treacherous waters of ideological conformity while trying to conduct actual research. The regime had declared relativity theory to be Jewish physics and promoted instead Deutsche Physik, which rejected mathematical abstraction in favor of intuitive, Aryan understanding of nature. Philipp Lenard, a Nobel laureate who became an ardent Nazi, published a 4-volume textbook on German physics that dismissed Einstein's work as incomprehensible mathematical trickery. Werner Heisenberg, who remained in Germany and led the Nazi atomic research program, later described the absurdity of having to defend quantum mechanics against party ideologues who considered it suspiciously mathematical and therefore potentially Jewish. He recalled a particularly bizarre meeting in 1937 where SS officers interrogated him about whether his work was sufficiently Germanic in spirit. Johannes Stark, another Nobel laureate turned Nazi ideologue, publicly attacked Heisenberg in the SS journal Das Schwarze Korps, calling him a white Jew and suggesting he should be imprisoned. Only the intervention of Heisenberg's mother, who had social connections to Himmler's family, saved him from arrest. This toxic mixture produced some genuinely advanced concepts alongside utter fantasy. The V-2 rocket, developed at Peenemünde, was a legitimate technological marvel, the first man-made object to reach space and the direct ancestor of all modern space launch vehicles. Standing 14 meters tall and weighing 12.5 tons, the V-2 was an engineering achievement that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. When the first V-2 successfully reached an altitude of 85 kilometers in October 1942, breaking through the boundary between atmosphere and space, Walter Dornberger, the military commander of the program, declared, "Today the spaceship was born." His enthusiasm was genuine, even if the immediate application was raining explosives on London. Dornberger, an artillery officer by training, had championed rocket development since the 1930 seconds, despite skepticism from conventional military minds. Von Braun, then just 30 years old, had created a liquid-fueled rocket that could travel over 200 kilometers farther than any artillery shell, and do so in just 5 minutes. Yet the same facility that produced the V-2 also explored increasingly fantastical concepts: multi-stage intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach New York, orbital bombardment platforms, and even anti-gravity propulsion systems that had no basis in actual physics. One particularly absurd proposal, designated the America Bomber, envisioned a massive rocket plane combination that would launch from Europe, bomb New York, then somehow land in Japanese-controlled territory, a mission profile that ignored basic questions like where the fuel would come from or how the crew would survive. Engineers later admitted they drew up these plans primarily to secure continued funding, knowing full well they were impossible. The Ahnenerbe, an SS institute officially dedicated to researching the ancestral heritage of the Nordic race, epitomized the regime's descent into mystical pseudoscience. Founded by Himmler in 1935, the organization sent expeditions to Tibet, searching for traces of ancient Aryan civilizations, conducted archaeological digs to prove Germanic racial superiority, and eventually became involved in various fringe scientific programs. Ernst Schaefer, a zoologist and explorer, led the 1938-39 Tibet expedition, ostensibly to study the region's flora and fauna, but secretly tasked with finding evidence that Tibetans were descendants of an ancient Aryan master race. The expedition returned with thousands of specimens and photographs, but zero evidence of Aryan ancestry, which didn't prevent Himmler from declaring it a success. Himmler genuinely believed that ancient Germanic tribes had possessed advanced technology that had been lost, and he tasked Ahnenerbe researchers with recovering this supposed ancestral knowledge. He was obsessed with the idea that Atlantis had been a real Germanic civilization destroyed by Jewish conspirators, and he sponsored research into world ice theory, a completely discredited cosmology invented by Austrian engineer Hans Herbiger that claimed the moon was made of ice, and that ice from space had destroyed ancient advanced civilizations. In practice, this meant that scientists with legitimate training found themselves working alongside mystics who believed in hollow earth theories and Atlantean superweapons. When rational objections were raised, Himmler would invoke Hitler's authority. The Führer has shown us that the impossible can become possible through will alone. Otto Rahn, an Ahnenerbe researcher obsessed with finding the Holy Grail in southern France, spent years searching Cathar ruins before his mysterious death in 1939 officially ruled a self-inflicted death, though some colleagues suspected he was killed after expressing doubts about Nazi ideology. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944, Hitler's demand for miracle weapons became increasingly hysterical. At military briefings in the Führer bunker in Berlin, he would rage against his generals for their lack of imagination and insist that victory remained achievable if only German science would deliver the breakthrough weapons he had been promised. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, who attended many of these briefings after being appointed Chief of the General Staff in July 1944, later wrote, "Hitler lived in a fantasy world where technological miracles would materialize through sheer force of will." He confused determination with delusion. Guderian described surreal meetings where Hitler would spend hours discussing wonder weapons while ignoring reports of Soviet armies advancing across Poland. The disconnect between Hitler's expectations and physical reality widened into a chasm. Engineers were ordered to create weapons that violated basic principles of physics, economics, and manufacturing capacity. When they explained that certain projects were impossible, Hitler interpreted their realism as defeatism, sometimes threatening them with imprisonment or worse. Tank designer Ferdinand Porsche, creator of the massive Tiger II tank, found himself in Hitler's favor, despite his designs being notoriously unreliable and expensive to produce. The Tiger II cost 800,000 Reichsmarks and required 300,000 man-hours to build, whereas the Soviets could produce 5 T-34 seconds for the same resources. But Hitler loved the Tiger II's imposing appearance and powerful gun, dismissing concerns about its mechanical unreliability and fuel consumption as defeatist thinking. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter became the perfect symbol of this dysfunction. The aircraft itself was brilliantly conceived and genuinely revolutionary, a swept-wing jet capable of speeds that made conventional fighters obsolete. Test pilot Fritz Wendel flew the first prototype in July 1942 and reported that it handled like a dream, though the Jumo 004 jet engines were temperamental and had a service life of only 25 hours before requiring replacement. But Hitler's interference turned it into a cautionary tale about innovation crushed by ideology. When Hitler saw the Me-262 inches November 1943 at a demonstration at Insterburg in East Prussia, he became obsessed with converting it into a bomber, convinced that fast bombers could terrorize Britain into surrender and prevent the anticipated Allied invasion of France. His chief test pilot, Hannah Reach, tried to explain that the aircraft's design made it poorly suited for bombing. It could only carry 500 kilograms of bombs, and its speed made accurate bombing nearly impossible. But Hitler silenced her. "I want bombers, not fighters. Every aircraft you show me is a fighter. I have no use for fighters at this stage." Reich, a fanatical Nazi herself, later recalled being shocked by Hitler's complete disconnection from military reality. The resulting delays meant that the Me-262 didn't enter mass production until early 1944, by which time Allied air superiority was already overwhelming. Goering compounded the problem by insisting that the Me-262 be built in multiple variants, a fighter version, a bomber version, a reconnaissance version, which scattered production efforts. General Adolf Galland later estimated that if the Me-262 had been deployed as a pure fighter in 1943 with concentrated production, we could have prevented the Allied daylight bombing offensive and prolonged the war by years. Instead, bureaucratic chaos and Hitler's strategic blindness transformed a potential war winner into an expensive footnote that arrived too late and in numbers too small to matter. The jet engine itself had emerged from the Junkers Corporation's research division, where Dr. Hans von Ohain had developed a working turbojet in 1939, days before Frank Whittle's similar British design. Von Ohain working at the Heinkel Company's facility in Rostock, had achieved the first jet-powered flight in August 1939 with the Heinkel He-178, beating Whittle by several months, though Whittle had patented the concept earlier. By 1944, German jets were the most advanced in the world, but Germany lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials to produce them in meaningful numbers. The Jumo 004 jet engine required exotic heat-resistant alloys containing nickel and chromium, materials that Germany could no longer import in quantity. Engineers were forced to use inferior substitutes, which resulted in engines that frequently caught fire or disintegrated at high speeds. BMW and Junkers competed to build better jet engines, each claiming their design was superior, while precious manufacturing capacity was divided between incompatible systems. Meanwhile, Allied bombing was systematically destroying the factories where these engines would be built. The Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg was hit by massive raids in August 1943, with 376 B-17 flying fortresses dropping over 1,100 tons of bombs and setting back Me-262 production by months. The crueler irony was that Germany possessed the knowledge to build jets but lacked the time, resources, and rational leadership to exploit that knowledge before the war was lost. By early 1945, Me-262 seconds were being dispersed to autobahn strips and hidden in forests to protect them from Allied bombing. But chronic fuel shortages meant many never flew. In June 1942, as German forces pressed deep into the Soviet Union and Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps threatened Egypt, an engineer named Edward Grotter sat in an office at the Krupp Works in Essen, sketching what would become history's most absurd military vehicle, the Landkreuzer P-1000. Ratte the Rat was a land battleship so monumentally impractical that it transcended mere engineering failure and entered the realm of technological fantasy. Weighing 1,000 tons, longer than a city block at 35 meters, and standing as tall as a 3-story building, the Ratte would have dwarfed even the massive Maus super-heavy tank that Ferdinand Porsche was developing. Its main armament consisted of the same 280mm naval guns used on the Scharnhorst-class battleships, weapons designed to sink warships now proposed for a vehicle that would have to cross bridges and navigate through European villages. The secondary armament included a 128mm anti-tank gun, identical to those mounted on the Jagdtiger tank destroyer, 8 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, and 2 15mm machine guns. The crew would have numbered over 40 men, living inside this mobile fortress like sailors on a ship, complete with sleeping quarters, a galley, and medical facilities. Hitler, upon seeing the initial sketches in early 1943, during a meeting at the Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia, was reportedly delighted, envisioning fleets of these titans crushing Soviet defenses and rolling inexorably toward Moscow. He allegedly compared them to medieval siege towers, saying, "The Bolsheviks will flee in terror when they see these approaching." Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, one of the few Nazi officials still tethered to reality, took one look at the proposal and cancelled the project in December 1942 before a single prototype could be built. It was the very embodiment of Hitler's megalomania translated into steel. Speer later wrote in his memoirs, "A monument to our regime's complete disconnection from strategic sense." The Ratte's technical specifications read like a catalogue of impossibilities that should have ended the project before it began. Each of its tracks would have been over a meter wide, similar to those used on excavation equipment, and the vehicle's ground pressure, despite the massive track area, would still have been high enough to damage most road surfaces. The weight would have made it incapable of crossing any bridge in Europe. Even the massive railway bridges spanning the Rhine couldn't support such mass. Engineers proposed that it ford rivers along the riverbed itself, operating like a submarine on land, with a snorkel system allowing the engines to breathe while submerged. This solution ignored the obvious problem that most riverbeds are muddy and would likely bog down even this behemoth. The fuel consumption was estimated at a staggering 2,000 litres per 100 kilometres under optimal conditions, meaning the Ratte would have required its own dedicated fuel convoy, essentially a fleet of tanker trucks following it everywhere just to move across a battlefield. Its top speed was projected at 40 kilometers per hour on paved roads, probably half that across country, making it slower than infantry on the march and barely faster than a man could jog. Enemy aircraft would have had ample time to circle overhead and drop bombs at leisure, and the raté's size, roughly equivalent to a small apartment building, would have made camouflage impossible. Reconnaissance aircraft would spot it from miles away, its massive tracks leaving a trail visible from high altitude. Grotte, who had previously worked on Soviet tank designs in the late 1920s before coming to Germany, knew the project was madness, but continued working on it because refusing Hitler's pet projects could be dangerous to one's health and freedom. He had witnessed what happened to engineers who told the Führer that his ideas were impractical. They tended to find themselves reassigned to the Eastern Front, or worse. The Ratte exemplified what historians would later call Nazi gigantism, the regime's obsession with size as a substitute for effectiveness, a psychological compensation for strategic weakness disguised as technological ambition. It was the same mentality that produced the massive Schwerer Gustav railway gun, which weighed 1,350 tons, required 250 men to operate, fired 7 shells per day at most, and needed 2 specially prepared parallel railway tracks to move. The Gustav took 5 weeks to assemble at the siege of Sevastopol in 1942, requiring 4,000 men to lay track, prepare firing positions, and provide security against partisans. It arrived only after the Wehrmacht had already breached the city's defenses using conventional artillery that cost a fraction as much and could be moved far more easily, is less than #0. 4 is greater than the Gustav fired 48 shells at Sevastopol over several days in June 1942, each 7-ton shell costing as much as a medium tank, achieving results that conventional artillery could have accomplished more efficiently and at far less expense. General Erich von Manstein, who commanded the siege, politely thanked the gun crews, but privately told his staff that the weapon was an impressive waste of resources. 1 shell did penetrate an underground ammunition magazine 30 meters below Severnaya Bay, causing a spectacular explosion, but this singular success hardly justified the enormous investment. After Sevastopol, the Gustav was used briefly at Leningrad, then dismantled and never reassembled by 1944. Germany lacked both the resources and the strategic situation where such a weapon could be deployed. Its sister gun, Dora, met a similar fate. Both were destroyed by German forces in 1945 to prevent capture, blown apart in railway yards as Allied armies closed in, ending the brief and inglorious career of history's largest artillery pieces. While the Ratte never progressed beyond sketches and some preliminary engineering studies at Krupp, another revolutionary design came tantalizingly close to changing aerial warfare forever. The Horten Ho 229, developed by brothers Reimar and Walter Horten at their workshop in Göttingen, represented a conceptual leap that wouldn't be matched until stealth aircraft appeared 4 decades later. The flying wing design eliminated the traditional fuselage and tail, creating a smooth, aerodynamic shape that the Hortens believed would maximize efficiency and speed while minimizing drag and weight. They had been experimenting with flying wings since the 1932, building a series of elegant gliders that demonstrated the concept's viability. Their Ho-2 glider of 1934 had flown successfully, proving that a tailless aircraft could be controlled effectively. The brothers were inspired partly by observing birds in flight, and partly by pure aerodynamic theory that suggested the traditional fuselage was fundamentally inefficient, adding weight and drag without contributing lift. When Hermann Göring issued his impossible 3x1000 requirement in 1943, an aircraft capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of bombs over 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers per hour, the Horten brothers saw their opportunity to prove their unorthodox ideas on a larger scale. Working with plywood and a revolutionary carbon-impregnated glue to save weight and scarce metals, they created an aircraft that accidentally achieved rudimentary stealth characteristics. The Ho 229's wooden construction and special coating developed partly to bind the plywood and partly to provide fire resistance, would absorb rather than reflect radar waves, reducing its detection range significantly. The first prototype, the Ho-229V1, was an unpowered glider tested in March 1944 at Oranienburg, flown by test pilot Erwin Ziller, and proving that the design was fundamentally sound. In December 1944, test pilot Ziller took the second prototype, designated V2 and equipped with two Junkers Jumo 4B turbojet engines. On its first powered flight at Oranienburg airfield north of Berlin, is less than #0. 4# is greater than the aircraft performed beautifully, exceeding all speed expectations and handling with surprising grace given its unconventional configuration. Ziller reported that it was as smooth as a Stradivarius, with none of the control issues that skeptics had predicted. But on the 18th of February 1945, during the third test flight, one of the Jumo 004 jet engines failed during the landing approach. Ziller attempted to abort the landing and go around on one engine, but the asymmetric thrust caused the aircraft to enter an uncontrollable roll. The Ho-229 crashed into the ground from about 40 feet, the impact killing Ziller instantly and destroying the prototype. Reimar Horten, who witnessed the crash, was devastated he had lost both his test pilot and his most advanced prototype in one terrible moment. The program never recovered from this setback, though work continued on the V3 prototype at the Gothaer wagon fabric factory in Friedrichsrode. By April 1945, the V3 was approximately 80% complete when American troops from the 3rd Armored Division overran the factory. A young American officer, Captain Harold Watson, recognized that the strange aircraft represented something extraordinary and arranged for it to be shipped to the United States as war booty, even though he had no authorization to do so. The Ho-229V3 prototype ended up at Freeman Field in Indiana, then spent decades in storage at the Smithsonian Institution's Paul E. Garber Preservation, Restoration, and Storage Facility in Maryland. It wasn't until 2008 that Northrop Grumman engineers were granted access to study the design for a National Geographic documentary titled Hitler's Stealth Fighter. Using modern radar cross-section analysis and computer modeling, they concluded that the Horten brothers had indeed stumbled onto stealth principles. The aircraft's shape and materials would have reduced its radar cross-section by approximately 37% compared to conventional aircraft of the era, potentially allowing it to approach within 80% of the normal detection distance before British chain-home radar stations would spot it. This meant the aircraft could get several miles closer before being detected, reducing warning time for fighters to intercept. Jack Northrop, the American pioneer of flying wing designs, would have recognized a kindred spirit in the Horten brothers. His own B-2 Spirit bomber, unveiled in 1988 and incorporating sophisticated stealth technology, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Ho-229, though developed independently using far more advanced materials and computer design. Reimar Horten survived the war, worked briefly in Argentina designing aircraft for Juan Perón's government, then returned to Germany where he lived quietly until his death in 1994. He later corresponded with Northrop engineers, discussing the parallel evolution of their ideas across enemy lines and decades. "We were trying to win a war," Horten wrote in a 1950 letter to an American aviation journal, "while you were trying to prevent one. Perhaps that's why your flying wings succeeded where ours failed." The tragedy of the Ho-229 was that it represented genuine innovation strangled by circumstance. By the time the aircraft was ready for testing, Germany's industrial base was collapsing under Allied bombing. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were cancelled, and trained pilots were scarcer still, dying over Germany, defending against bomber streams. Even if the Ho-229 had entered production in 1944, Germany lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce the hundreds that would have been needed to impact the war's outcome. And the Jumo 004 engines remained unreliable, with service lives measured in hours rather than the hundreds of hours needed for operational aircraft. While jets and supertanks captured Hitler's imagination with their futuristic appeal, Artillery officers were developing their own wonder weapon with roots stretching back to World War I and the golden age of superguns. The V3 cannon, officially designated the Hochdruckpumpe, but nicknamed the London gun by its designers and the millipede by workers who saw its segmented barrel, represented an attempt to resurrect the concept of ultra-long-range bombardment that had terrorized Paris in 1918. The original Paris gun, actually a series of 7 different guns designed by the Krupp Works, had fired 183-kilogram shells from 120 kilometers away, raining destruction on the French capital from positions German troops never physically reached. The psychological impact had been enormous. Parisians couldn't comprehend how they were being shelled from such distance, and many believed they were being attacked by high-altitude aircraft or even bombardment from the stratosphere. The V3 was far more ambitious in scale and mechanism, a multi-chamber gun barrel 130 meters long, angled at 50 degrees and embedded in a hillside at Memoir in the Pas-de-Calais region of France, just 165 kilometers from London. The barrel featured a series of side chambers arranged in pairs along its length, filled with additional propellant that would ignite in sequence as the shell traveled down the barrel, continuously accelerating it to speeds exceeding 1,500 meters per second, faster than almost any gun then in existence. If it worked as designed, the V3 would fire 300 shells per hour at London, delivering 10 tons of high explosives daily without requiring aircraft or rockets, making it a perpetual bombardment machine that would operate around the clock. Construction began in September 1943 with Organization TOT, the Third Reich's engineering and construction division, mobilizing thousands of forced laborers from across occupied Europe to excavate the massive concrete bunkers that would house 5 gun barrels arranged in a battery. The workers, mainly French, Belgian, and Eastern European prisoners, dug into the chalk hillside using pneumatic drills and explosives, creating a complex of shafts and tunnels that extended deep underground. The engineer August Coenders, who had worked on the Paris gun in World War I and was now in his 60s, oversaw the project with the enthusiasm of a man given a second chance at his life's work. He had spent the interwar years convinced that multi-chamber guns represented the future of artillery, and he finally had the resources and authority to prove it. But the V3 was plagued by problems from the start that suggested the concept was fundamentally flawed. Test firings at the proving ground at Mistroy on the Baltic coast, using a shortened 50-meter version of the barrel, revealed that the side chambers didn't ignite reliably, causing erratic trajectories and sometimes destroying the barrel entirely when propellant ignited out of sequence. The immense forces involved pressures exceeding 5,000 atmospheres caused metal fatigue far faster than anticipated, with barrel life measured in dozens of shots rather than the thousands needed for sustained bombardment. Engineers tried various solutions: different propellant mixtures, modified ignition timing, reinforced barrel construction. Nothing worked consistently. Worse for the Germans, British intelligence learned about the project through multiple sources. French resistance members who observed the construction reported to London. Reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF Spitfires showed the distinctive angled gun positions and their massive concrete covers, and intercepted German communications mentioned the Hochdruckpumpe. Winston Churchill took a personal interest, demanding regular updates on what British intelligence codenamed Operation Crossbow, the effort to locate and destroy German long-range weapons. On the 6th of July 1944, just 1 month after D-Day, RAF Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron, the famous Dambusters, armed with 12,000-pound tall-boy earthquake bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis, attacked Mimoyex in broad daylight. Squadron leader J.L. Bazin scored a direct hit with a tallboy that penetrated 30 meters of earth and concrete before detonating, collapsing one of the main shafts, killing dozens of workers and irreparably damaging the installation's internal structure. The remaining guns were never completed, and the site was abandoned in August 1944 as Allied armies advanced across France. A smaller 2-barrel version, with barrels only 50 meters long, was briefly deployed at Lamperden in Germany to bombard Luxembourg in December 1944, firing approximately 180 shells over 2 days with negligible effect. a few buildings damaged. No strategic impact whatsoever before American forces overran the position. One gun barrel survives today, displayed at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, Maryland, a monument to ambitious failure. Compared to the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, the V-3 was a spectacular failure that never justified its enormous cost in resources and labor. It cost approximately 50 million Reichsmarks, diverted thousands of workers from more practical projects like building Atlantic Wall fortifications, and never fired a single shot at its intended target. The V-1, crude as it was essentially a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine that made a distinctive buzzing sound, delivered over 10,000 bombs to London and southern England between June 1944 and March 1945, killing over 6,000 people and damaging hundreds of thousands of buildings. Londoners called them buzz bombs or doodlebugs, and the sudden silence when the engine cut out, signaling the bomb's descent, became one of the war's most terrifying sounds. The V-2, vastly more sophisticated, killed nearly 3,000 inches London and Antwerp, with the first V-2 striking Chiswick in London on the 8th of September 1944, killing 3 people and leaving a crater 30 feet across. Both weapons were terror weapons par excellence, militarily inefficient but psychologically devastating, designed more to break civilian morale than to destroy strategic targets. The V-2 was particularly insidious because it arrived without warning, faster than sound, so victims never heard it coming. The explosion was the first indication of attack. Yet for all their destructive power and the fear they inspired, the V-weapons represented a strategic miscalculation of staggering proportions that demonstrated how desperation can corrupt military judgment. Each V-2 rocket cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture at the Mittelwerk underground factory, where 60,000 prisoners labored in horrific conditions, working 18-hour shifts in tunnels with no daylight, sleeping in unheated barracks, dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, and random executions. Each rocket required 30 tons of potatoes to produce the alcohol fuel for a single launch, potatoes that could have fed thousands of civilians or soldiers. Albert Speer calculated that the entire V-2 program consumed resources equivalent to 24,000 fighter aircraft fighters that could have been used to defend German cities from Allied bombing or support ground forces on the Eastern Front. When asked after the war during the Nuremberg trials whether the V-weapons had been worth the cost, Speer was blunt. "We would have been better off building more fighters and fewer revenge weapons." The V-2 was a technological marvel and a strategic disaster. It represented the triumph of engineering over common sense. General Walter Dornberger, the military commander of the V-2 program who had championed rocket development since the 1932nd, defended his creation until his death in 1980, insisting that if the program had started earlier and produced more rockets, it could have disrupted the Allied war effort sufficiently to change the war's outcome. But the mathematics were unforgiving and demolished his argument even at peak production in January 1945. Germany was firing approximately 30 volts 2 seconds per day at London and Antwerp, delivering perhaps 30 tons of explosives. A single RAF bombing raid on Berlin in November 1943 had dropped 2,300 tons of bombs in one night. The comparison was grotesque. Germany was investing enormous resources in a weapon that delivered less explosive power than one enemy bombing raid. The V-weapons were Hitler's vengeance, striking back at the cities that had bombed Germany, but they were a pinprick compared to the devastation being inflicted in return by thousand-bomber raids that turned entire cities into infernos. Among the strangest of all Nazi secret weapons programs was one that may not have existed at all in the form described, or may have been something entirely different from what post-war mythology claimed. Die Glock the Bell has become a fixture of alternative history and conspiracy theories, described variously as an anti-gravity device, a time machine, a portal to other dimensions, or even a weapon capable of destroying matter at the atomic level. The source of these claims was a Polish military journalist named Igor Witkowski, who in 2000 published a book titled Prawda o Wunderwaffe, claiming that in 1997 he had been shown classified Polish intelligence documents describing a bell-shaped device tested at a facility near the time. Wenceslaus mine in Lower Silesia, now part of Poland but German territory during the war. According to Witkowski's account, which has never been independently verified and which he later embellished in subsequent books and interviews, the device was approximately 7 meters wide and 7 meters high, constructed from a heavy metal, possibly ceramics, and filled with a mysterious substance called Zerum 525, allegedly a violet glowing liquid, possibly red mercury or a mercury compound mixed with thorium. The bell supposedly rotated at high speed, powered by unclear means, and produced strange effects on nearby materials and living organisms, causing crystallization of blood, rapid decomposition of plant matter, and bizarre electromagnetic interference. Test subjects, prisoners from nearby concentration camps, according to the claims, allegedly died from exposure to whatever radiation or field the bell generated, their bodies showing effects consistent with intense radiation poisoning, but also some anomalies that didn't match known radiation effects. The problem with Die Glocke is that no primary documentation has ever been produced to support these extraordinary claims, despite decades of interest from researchers and journalists. Witkowski claimed the documents he saw in 1997 were Polish intelligence files that were subsequently destroyed or remain classified at the highest levels, and no independent researcher has been able to verify their existence. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance, which holds most wartime intelligence documents, has no record of such files. The Wenceslaus mine does exist near the town of Ludwikowice Kłodzkie, and it was indeed used by the Nazis for unknown purposes in the war's final months. There are concrete structures and tunnel complexes that remain unexplained, but there's no credible evidence of anti-gravity experiments or exotic physics research conducted there. Historians have proposed more mundane explanations that fit the fragmentary evidence better than science fiction scenarios. The bell, if it existed at all in some form, may have been a centrifuge for uranium enrichment, part of Germany's fumbling attempts to develop atomic weapons under Werner Heisenberg's direction. The German nuclear program never achieved a sustained chain reaction, partly because Heisenberg made crucial miscalculations about the amount of enriched uranium needed, but they did experiment with various enrichment methods. A centrifuge enrichment system would have been bell-shaped, would have contained metallic compounds, would have rotated at high speed, and could have produced radiation effects on nearby organisms. Or the device could have been a test rig for shaped charge warheads, which would explain the violent effects on materials described in the alleged documents. Shaped charges focus explosive force through careful geometry, creating jets of superheated metal that can penetrate armor, and testing such devices would indeed destroy organic matter nearby. Some researchers have suggested the bell was related to Victor Schauberger's vortex theories. Schauberger was an Austrian forest warden turned inventor who developed unusual theories about energy and rotation, and he was briefly employed by the SS in 1944, though his work focused on water turbines and propulsion rather than weaponry. SS General Hans Kammler, who supposedly oversaw the Bell project according to Witkowski, was indeed responsible for many secret weapons programs, including the V2, construction of underground factories, and late-war advanced weapons development. Kammler was a brutal technocrat who used slave labor without hesitation and who accumulated enormous power in the war's final months as Hitler became increasingly detached from reality. He disappeared in the war's final days in April or May 1945, fueling speculation that he escaped with secret technology, perhaps fleeing to South America or even defecting to the Americans with classified knowledge. But Kammler probably died in May 1945, either by taking his own life to avoid capture or by being killed by his own men who feared being held responsible for his war crimes. Multiple witnesses reported his death, though the circumstances are unclear and no body was ever positively identified. The enduring fascination with Die Glocke reflects less about what the Nazis actually built and more about our collective need to imagine that their defeat prevented even more terrible weapons from emerging. That evil, that profound, must have been on the verge of earth-shattering discoveries. The reality is more banal and perhaps more disturbing. Nazi Germany's most secret projects were often expensive failures that consumed resources better spent on conventional weapons, managed by men whose understanding of physics was corrupted by ideology, and whose strategic judgment was warped by desperation. The mythology of Nazi superscience persists because it provides a comforting narrative that the Allies won not just through industrial might, moral superiority, and better strategy, but because they defeated an enemy on the verge of technological breakthrough. It makes the victory seem narrower and therefore more heroic. But the historical evidence suggests the opposite. By 1944, Nazi Germany was scientifically and technologically falling behind the Allies in almost every meaningful way, despite producing some genuinely innovative designs. The SS did operate numerous classified research programs in the war's final years, increasingly divorced from military reality and descending into pseudoscience and atrocity. At the Institute for Military Scientific Research in Dachau, doctors including Sigmund Rasche conducted experiments on prisoners to test high-altitude exposure, hypothermia, and the effects of various toxins, atrocities masquerading as science that advanced medical knowledge not at all, while murdering hundreds of prisoners. Rasche's altitude experiments killed approximately 200 prisoners, subjecting them to pressure chamber tests that simulated altitudes up to 68,000 feet until their lungs burst. His hypothermia experiments, supposedly to help German pilots shot down over the North Sea, involved placing prisoners naked in ice water and timing how long they survived. These weren't experiments in any scientific sense, they were torture sessions with clipboards. Himmler's Ahnenerbe sponsored research into Vril energy, a supposed cosmic force described in Edward Bulwer-Lytton's 1871 occult novel The Coming Race, that Nazis believed might be real and could be harnessed as a power source or weapon. Resources were devoted to dowsing for oil using divining rods, testing ancient Germanic herbal remedies that had no pharmacological basis, and trying to breed livestock based on descriptions in medieval manuscripts rather than modern genetics. When rational scientists objected that these projects had no scientific basis and were wasting resources, they were reminded that the Führer himself believed in willpower over physics and that questioning his judgment was tantamount to treason. By 1945, the gap between Nazi technological fantasy and reality had become absolute, a chasm that no amount of engineering genius could bridge. Hitler spent his final days in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery, convinced that new superweapons would still turn the tide. He spoke of jet fighters that would sweep the Allies from the skies, of new U-boats that would starve Britain, of wonder weapons still being perfected in underground laboratories. On the 22nd of April 1945, when told that SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner's promised counterattack to relieve Berlin hadn't materialized because Steiner lacked the forces to attack, Hitler finally broke down, admitting for the first time that the war was lost. But even then, he blamed betrayal and cowardice rather than strategic reality. The wonder weapons had failed not because they weren't wonderful enough, but because war is won through logistics, production, rational strategy, and the ability to mass-produce reliable weapons rather than perfect exotic ones. As the Third Reich burned in the spring of 1945, its most advanced prototypes sat abandoned in factories or were deliberately destroyed to prevent capture. The Ho 229 inches its factory, experimental jet engines in their testing facilities, prototype tanks in their proving grounds, all monuments to innovation strangled by ideology, genius corrupted by evil, and the fatal delusion that technology alone could compensate for strategic catastrophe, moral bankruptcy, and a regime built on lies fighting a war it could never win. As the guns fell silent in 1918, a different revolution began, led not from the trenches, but from the hearts and hands of women who had held nations together. From the nurses on the Western Front to the factory workers forging steel and hope, their courage reshaped the world. It was then that voices like Emmeline Pankhurst's rang clear. We are here, not because we are lawbreakers. We are here in our efforts to become lawmakers. Their struggle for equality was the second battle of the Great War, one fought not with weapons, but with will. Thank you for honoring their legacy with me. Until our next story, remember, every right we hold was once a fight someone refused to lose.